On May 25, 1660, a warship finally dropped its anchors off the English coast, marking the end of a long journey. Charles II stepped ashore under the white cliffs of Dover, ending nearly a decade of exile in France and the Netherlands. The returning royal party stepped onto the shingle in salt-stained, travel-worn clothes. Standing waiting to receive them were men in the pragmatic, somber buff coats of the new model army. While cheering crowds eventually lined the streets of London, the return of the crown was driven less by a sudden national longing for the Stuarts and more by the functional exhaustion of the state. Over the previous decade, the English government had systematically cycled through every republican governance model available to it. The Rump Parliament was dissolved, the Protectorate attempted to consolidate power, until military rule fractured the country. By 1660, the invitation for Charles to return was becoming the only viable path to avoid a total systemic collapse. The institution he was inheriting was, in every practical sense, a damaged and functionally bankrupt entity. Many of the men now escorting him to the capital were the same institutional actors who had spent the last 10 years dismantling his father's monarchy. To understand why these former enemies were now his primary sponsors, we have to look at the financial ruins that made this transition mandatory. The crisis began in late 1658, when the death of Oliver Cromwell removed the only figure capable of holding the Republic's competing factions together. His son, Richard Cromwell, lacked any standing with the military. Within months, his authority vanished, leaving the army as the only functional power in the country. Without a central leader, the English state fractured into competing military factions, led by Generals Lambert and Fleetwood. This infighting rendered the Protectorate operationally dead. The government lost the ability to enforce laws or manage basic administration at the local level. As the political center paralyzed, the state's revenue collection infrastructure began to fail. Taxes simply stopped flowing into London. This chart maps the state's flatlining tax revenue against the aggressively compounding curve of unpaid wages owed to the army. By 1659, military debt eclipsed total borrowing capacity. Unpaid professional armies historically transition into domestic pillaging to survive. No entity in England held the recognized constitutional authority to authorize the emergency taxation needed to pay the soldiers and prevent an outbreak of violence. Disrupted supply lines and a lack of pay meant that by the winter, many active regiments were facing literal starvation. The political crisis had mutated into a hard fiscal deadline. Without an immediate injection of capital and legitimacy, the English state was going to dissolve. General George Monck recognized this reality and began marching his veteran forces south from Scotland toward London. Monck's motivations were operational rather than ideological. He had spent years serving the Commonwealth, and his primary concern was the preservation of a stable, paid military force. He acted as a pragmatic military executive, seeking a solution to the army's mounting cash flow crisis before his own troops mutinied. Monck realized that only a traditional executive with broad public recognition could provide the legal framework required to secure a national financial settlement. He avoided a major battlefield confrontation, instead using logistical attrition to outmaneuver General Lambert's rival faction until their support base evaporated. Once in London, Monck forced the reinstatement of previously purged parliamentary members, creating a legislative body capable of ending the interregnum. The return of the crown was essentially a managed bankruptcy proceeding, orchestrated by the military to secure its own back pay and a peaceful liquidation. The mechanism for this transition was the Declaration of Breda, issued by Charles in April 1660. This royal proclamation functioned as a binding corporate term sheet, laying out the conditions for the merger between the old monarchy and the new state. The Indemnity and Oblivion Clause provided a blanket legal amnesty, protecting the existing political elite from being prosecuted for treason. It explicitly excluded the regicides, those involved in the king's execution, establishing a limit to forgiveness. To prevent religious civil war, the Liberty of Conscience Clause promised tolerance for religious dissenters. Critically, the declaration protected interregnum property transfers. Investors kept their lands. Charles also made an explicit commitment to rule in direct cooperation with Parliament. This clause established a legal requirement for cooperation, ensuring the executive could no longer bypass Parliament to authorize major policy or funding. The Declaration of Breda provided the specific legal and financial assurances the country's stakeholders required to approve the transition without facing personal or economic ruin. The Convention Parliament that met in April 1660 acted as a board of directors managing a hostile takeover. Their immediate mandate was the passage of a financial settlement massive enough to pay off and peacefully disband the new model army. They legislated a new poll tax, which was specifically earmarked to cover the massive arrears owed to the soldiers. To fund the ongoing government, they passed the Tonnage and Poundage Act, setting high customs duties on imported goods. These duties became the primary revenue engine for the incoming royal administration, tying the king's income directly to the health of national trade. They then formally passed the Indemnity and Oblivion Act to give the king's promises the full force of law, preventing future reprisals. These proceedings were not celebratory. They were bureaucratic, focused on balancing ledgers and managing the logistics of demobilization. The restoration was a financial transaction, driven by the need to balance the books and legally settle the debts of a decade of civil war. On May 29, 1660, Charles II entered London to take his place at the head of this restructured state. Parliament granted him an annual income of exactly £1.2 million to run the entire government, a figure that would prove insufficient for most of his reign. Because this income relied on customs and excise taxes, the king remained in a state of constant financial dependency on both merchant trade and parliamentary approval. Taking up residence at Whitehall, Charles inherited a massive administrative burden and the lingering debts of the Commonwealth. The historical image of the merry monarch ignores the reality of an executive who spent his reign navigating a minefield of insolvency and legislative oversight. The crown was restored, but it now operated within a rigid framework of debt and legislative dependency that the Stuarts would never truly escape.